So we've been talking about it quite a lot, especially last week, that when Brexit meets reality, reality always wins. There have been problems since day one, even before the referendum when this was being discussed, and these problems have continued because Brexiteers, and especially the leaders of the Brexiteers, just do not have answers to these questions. And these answers are pretty damn important. And this comes from The Guardian. And once again, it's a whole story of Brexit, reality. Brexit ain't surviving when it hits the wall of reality. The Tory contest shows the Brexiteers' dream is dying before their very eyes. Once they thought leaving the EU would work wonders, now they don't care what it achieves as long as it's done. Brexit is the reason the Conservatives are choosing a new leader. Yet the competition has become a race to change the subject. Candidates are being judged not by any probability of success in taking the UK out of the EU, but by the ability to comfort fellow Tories that there is life for their party on the other side once the deed is done. How to get there is a side issue. Boris Johnson is the forerunner because he is the master of misdirection, the conjuring technique for steering an audience's eye away from the sleight of hand deception passed off as magic. The whole Boris persona, careless hair and linguistic knowledge, is a vaudevillian trick that Johnson plays on British politics, manipulating debate away from his lying competence, idleness, philandering self-obsession and intellectual vacancy. Johnson's only credentials for the leadership are a charismatic energy that makes grassroots Tories feel good, and their belief that this power extends to other voters. It is a nebulous proposition, and a very electorally questionable one at that. Underrated and ill-suited for the job of completing Brexit. But it is also a pitch that Johnson's rivals are struggling to defeat, since none of them have a more credible plan for getting Britain out of the European Union before the 31st of October deadline. Their manifestos are all based on the same rhetorical pivot, a gymnastic manoeuvre that launches off from the current intractable situation and lands with a flourish in place where Brexit has already been delivered to a grateful nation. There is a misleading middle section in the routine that involves the contract with the other countries and Parliament. This has been the most stubborn piratical delusion in Tory thinking on Brexit. The belief is, in an internal party matter, that solutions can be cooked up on the backbenches and then dictated to the EU. In that view, Theresa May's failing was not her lack of fluency in the language of the European interests, but her refusal to explain British demands loudly enough at the concessions counter in Brussels. That misrepresentation has sabotaged diplomacy during the Article 50 negotiations, and it is now feeding the complacency about a no-deal Brexit. The Tory contenders who claim to be relaxed about the scenario trade in two vast falsehoods. One is that willingness to rip up draft treaties and renege on financial commitments somehow makes a country more credible in international negotiations. The other is that going through with such a threat hastens the day when Britain can sign free trade deals everywhere. In reality, the first calls that any Prime Minister would make within hours of a no-deal Brexit are not to Washington, but to Brussels. The topic would not be chlorinated chicken imports and averting a crisis at Dover and patching together the ad hoc legal requirements to sustain the inward flow of vital goods. No, it's the balance of power in that conversation would be on the British side. This is why some continental politicians are sadly coming around to the idea that no deal might be the only way to jolt the UK politicians into a clear-eyed appraisal of their country's needs regarding European markets and what it costs. The overwhelming EU preference is to avoid a messy breakdown in cross-channel relations. but hope of a late realism in surge of the there we go, inside of the Conservative Party is dwindling. The Tory members might not mind that that the ministerial careers of Johnson or Dominic Raab are marked by self-defeating bombast, ostentations, ignorance, but those who meet them in the international arena are less indulgent. Brexit is dead, one EU diplomat told me recently. Surprised by the bluntness of this assertion, I countered that it was still much alive. The clarification came back as yes, obviously it still could happen, and on the worst possible terms, but viewed from the outside intellectually as a proposition based on the original 26 arguments for leaving the EU, the debate is over, and not even the most nationalistic parties in other member states contemplate taking the Euroscepticism to lengths taken in Britain. It is true, actually, before we continue, that's something else that is true that needs to be discussed, that the Euroscepticism on the continent, because of Brexit, is dying. A lot of parties, especially the far-right parties, have drastically toned down their rhetoric on this. The whole idea that Marine Le Pen would be leading the what's been dubbed the Frexit, that's not on her manifesto anymore. She now wants to, quote, take control of the EU to better, quote, French interests. That won't happen. She's not talking about, again, France leaving the European Union. She's not talking about leaving the single market, because one of the things that we've said for so long on this channel is that there's a difference between British Euroscepticism and European Euroscepticism. So anyway, we'll get back to the article. It is true that candidates to be our next Prime Minister are struggling to connect the imperative of getting out of the EU with any tangible benefits to follow. Even hardliners, whose most cherished prize is a trade deal with the US, looked awkward last week during Donald Trump's visit, when the conversation turned to predatory, to private sector dealings on the NHS. The economic case, once so confident, has shriveled into a defensive ball. The pain can be minimised in the very best case scenario. There is a smooth transition and the whole process feels benignly pointless until the downsides become visible. Meanwhile, none of the tax cuts or spending pledges spewed from the leadership contest would be forbidden under EU rules. Esther McVey, the most radical Eurosceptic in the race, would cut foreign aid and give cash to schools and police. She doesn't need permission from Brussels to do that, however. She never did. In fact, it might be trickier in a financial emergency caused by a no-deal rupture. She is relaxed about pursuing the McVeigh-like Raab and is prepared to dissolve Parliament if it stood in the way. The wild notion is symbiotic of the way the Tory mania has mutated, from a belief that Brexit can work wonders to a state of not really caring what it achieves as long as it's done. There is the search for an alternative. Miracle cures to the nation's ailments can begin. Deep down, the majority of Conservative MPs know that the whole enterprise is a warehouse full of snake oil. So there is a twisted logic in giving the sales job to Johnson, the most talented charlatan. While Brexit is still the driving force in British politics, it is no longer a living programme for government. The Tories are trapped between the pressure to complete it at any cost, a force applied with the wrecking relish by Nigel Farage, and some residential understanding that to do it on Farage's terms would be a surrender to madness. It would be the same old UKIP agenda that has harried the Tories for years. Half of the leadership candidates are following it like Norman Bates, bullied by his mother in Hitchcock's Psycho. They say it is an irresistible force, but it is the kind of sinister internal disarrangement, the Brexit they crave, the one that unifies the party and the nation without ruin or rancour, is already dead. There might be no stop. That might not stop the next Prime Minister influencing something called Brexit on the country, but it is getting harder. There is only so long that a government can parade a corpse and ask the public to admire it. The Tories can dress it up in different costumes, stick a Boris-style wig on it, spray it with perfume, but the idea is itself has started to putrefy. It is the complexion that has turned sallow. None of the candidates acknowledge it, but there is a peculiar, nasty smell emanating from their contest. It is the project that has defined their party and the British government for the last 3 years, rotting under their noses. What can we say? It just goes on and on and on. And as we've said, we are now in a bizarre situation where we have... They want, as the article said, Brexit at any cost, and they just want to get there. It's that traditional, the South Park meme of, vote for Brexit, do Brexit, question mark, profit. There's no three. There's no three, and it's screaming in everyone's face, going, what do you do, to solve the problem of Brexit? The truth is you can't, because, as we've said before, it was always a pipe dream. It was always a fantasy cooked up by not acknowledging the realities that the UK has always been a stronger, one of the strongest members. Remember, it's referred to as one of the big three. It was always, the UK, Germany and France. They were the big three inside the EU, the ones with the most power. The big problem we have had in trying to influence that power is that UKIP have been there. UKIP who refuse to turn up, who don't vote, who do nothing. And we've talked about, Farage's record in the EU in the past, from what he's done. And that's the infuriating situation. We are in a awful situation where it is dead on arrival. Let's be honest, Brexit is DOA, and there is nothing that the Tories can do, there is nothing that Farage can do to revive it. Even if he somehow magically achieves Brexit, it does not deliver on a single promise that any of the Tories or Farage or any of the other people who campaign for leave will deliver on. And once again, we'll come back to the main point where the article finished on. The dream for the Brexit referendum was to unite the party. That has now gone. And we now live in a situation where even if Brexit doesn't happen, the Tories will face continuous election defeat because a lot of their people who vote Conservative or would vote Conservative will go and vote for the Brexit Party. But there are still a lot of people who will not vote for the Brexit Party, but are Conservatives and will not change from that party. That is their party. But the problem is those people who switched. And you saw that in Peterborough. You saw that in the Newport West by-election. That the main problem has always been is that UKIP and now the Brexit Party are taking votes away from the Conservatives. They don't like that because it stops them from winning. It stops them from winning a solid majority. It puts them to rest completely. And it puts them out of power. And if you've ever really talked to a serious Conservatives, talk to them about the periods of after 1997 up until about 2008. And just look at and talk to them about that period of the Conservative Party. It is one of loss and lack of powerlessness, and they do not want to be in that situation for as long as they were again, because they got so used to being in power throughout the late 70s, throughout the 80s, and early 90s, they got addicted to it. But the problem was that there was competence. And now you have a Tory party that is just being led by complete incompetence. And that is not how a government should be run. It is not who we should be rewarding with seats in Parliament. But there you go.